Hey, and welcome everybody. Today we're visiting the fourth country on our little whirlwind tour of European absolutism, and that fourth and final country is Russia. And we're going to cover Russia in two parts, so hey, let's get started on part one. Now, as we get into Russia, one of the things that we're going to see is that it is a very, very different place from Western Europe. Russia develops its own unique society that's really very isolated from that of Western Europe. But why? Why did Russia develop such a unique society? Why was Russia so separated and different from Western Europe? We will address that. Then we will meet the most important and powerful of Russia's early rulers, or czars as they call them in Russia, a guy by the name of Ivan. Ivan the Fourth, better known to history as Ivan the Terrible. Who is this Ivan the Terrible, and how does his reign set the standard for absolutist rule in Russia in the future? And then we'll finish up very, very briefly with a time period in Russia that they call the Time of Troubles. This is after the death of Ivan, a real period of chaos and disorder, and we'll see how what happens during this time period in Russian history that is going to pave the way for a future very important dynasty in Russia known as the Romanov dynasty. So those are the essential questions. That is what we're going to hit today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So from the 1200s to the 1700s, Russia is very, very isolated from Western Europe, and it is isolated from Western Europe's social, academic, and technological developments. Because Russia is so separated from Western Europe, when Western Europe is going through like the Renaissance and the Reformation and all these technological developments and intellectual developments, Russia's not experiencing those things because they are just so isolated and so separate. In a lot of ways, as Western Europe is developing and becoming, Renaissance and a more modern society, Russia is staying in very much the situation of a Dark Ages society. And there's several reasons for this isolation. The first has to do with the great schism between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Western Europe went with the Roman Catholic Church, and Eastern Europe and what would eventually become Russia went with the Eastern Orthodox Church. That's our first real break between the East and the West. And so what would become Russia sort of hitched itself to Eastern Orthodox faith, to the Byzantine Empire, and not with Western Europe. That's really where the separation begins. Now, on top of that, Russia is an absolutely vast territory. Okay, it's a huge territory, and Russia's political and population centers are very, very far away from the political centers of Western Europe. Places like Rome, London, Paris, Madrid in Spain, Amsterdam in the Netherlands are, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the center, political center, the capital of Russia, that would be Moscow. And this distance serves to keep Russia isolated from Western Europe. On top of that, if you know anything about the weather in Russia, it's really, really bad there in the winter. And those winters make travel very difficult. But to make matters worse, at this time in history, Russia's only water access or sea access was to the north. Well, in those really nasty cold winters, all that sea access would freeze. And with that sea access frozen, Russia basically becomes a landlocked country because they cannot travel by sea outward to be able to communicate with Western Europe. So that helps to keep Russia isolated from Western Europe. Lastly, and perhaps the most important, had to do with Russia's alphabet. See, in Western Europe, people generally had Latin-based alphabets and Latin-based languages, but the Russians never learned Latin, nor did they have a Latin-based language. See, when Christians brought Christianity to the Slavic people in what would eventually become Russia, rather than teaching them Christianity in Latin, they created a new alphabet. Two monks by the name of Cyril and Methodius, when they went to the Slavic people in what would become Russia, instead of teaching them Latin, they created a new alphabet that would be called the Cyrillic alphabet. That's the Cyrillic alphabet there on the screen in front of you, and it's, as you can see, it's very, very, very different from the Latin alphabet. So the Russians don't develop a Latin alphabet or a Latin-based alphabet or a Latin-based language, and so their language is very different from the Western European languages. The alphabet is very different, and so the communication between East and West is very, very difficult. These are all reasons why Russia becomes incredibly isolated from Western Europe, and this isolation leads Russia to develop its own sort of unique individual civilization that is very different from that of Western Europe. They sort of base their values on the Eastern Orthodox Church and the culture of the Byzantine Empire. And Russians in this unique society, live under ruling monarchs that they would eventually come to call czars. Originally, they were just ruled by a guy that was called the Crown Prince of Muscovy, or, Moscow. But eventually, the Crown Prince of Muscovy married the daughter of one of the last Byzantine emperors, and so the Russians ultimately saw themselves as the heirs of Rome, and they started taking on that title of czar, which is sort of a derivative of Caesar, what the Romans used to call their emperors. And then after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the additional connection that Russia really had, Russia became even more isolated now. And this isolation from Western Europe and the isolation from Western Europe developments caused Russia to lag centuries behind the West, technologically, socially, intellectually. As we mentioned earlier, while the Western Europe is developing through the Renaissance and all these other types of innovations and advancements, Russia is really remaining basically a Dark Ages society, centuries behind Western Europe. Now, the first really powerful and long-term influential character in the history of this Russian society, this really powerful and important czar who's going to set the stage for the future of absolute monarchy in Russia, is the Tsar Ivan IV, better known to history as Tsar Ivan the Terrible. Now, he's an interesting character, to say the least. Ivan became Tsar when he was 3 years old. He became Tsar because his father was murdered by the boyars. The boyars that's the Russian nobility. That's the word for the Russian nobility. And so because his father was murdered, he became Tsar at the age of 3. And he grows up in a world where he is surrounded by people constantly jockeying for position, looking to control him so they can therefore control the throne. And so he grows up in a place where he is surrounded by violence, abuse, and murder. And as we talked about in previous sessions, when we grow up and become adults, our personality is very much shaped by our experiences in our youth. And Ivan has a youth where he is surrounded by violence and murder. And so as a result, he grows to become a violent sociopath. It's said that by the time Ivan was about 5 or 6 years old, one of the things that he liked to do was go to one of the tall towers in the Kremlin and drop small animals off the roof to watch them fall. Killing animals. This is telltale behavior of what we might look at today as a serial killer in the making. So yeah, this is a guy whose environment and upbringing is making him into something not very good. Now, interestingly enough, and despite his sociopathic tendencies, he happened to be a deeply religious individual, attended church with great regularity, was deeply, deeply devoted to the Eastern Orthodox faith. And, to put it plainly, for a long time, he wasn't that bad of a ruler for a guy who's seen as, a sociopath. He was a pretty able administrator as ruler, as czar. I mean, he expands the borders of the Russian lands in a very, very substantial fashion. He defeats Russia's great enemies. He opens Russia to trade, specifically with England, I might add, was a regular correspondent with Queen Elizabeth, even offered her a proposal of marriage on more than one occasion. He commissioned large-scale building projects, some of which remain today as some of the most beautiful and well-known sites in all of Eastern Europe, if not all of the world. After defeating, because he was a good military leader too, after defeating one of Russia's traditional enemies, the Tatars, he commissioned, to sort of celebrate that victory, the construction of a great cathedral. The cathedral picture that you see in front of you there, it's an image known the world over. It's St. Basil's Cathedral, one of, for my money, the most beautiful and unique architectural structures that you will find pretty much anywhere. Of course, it's also said that when the structure was completed, he went to the architect and in awe told him it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and asked the guy, hey, could you ever make anything like this ever again? And as the story goes, the guy replied in the affirmative, and Ivan rewarded him by having his eyeballs cut out of his head, supposedly so he could never design something so beautiful ever again. So while he is an able administrator who appears to be doing some pretty solidly positive things for Russia, we do still see those sociopathic tendencies. And using force and violence and intimidation, Ivan manages to control Russia's nobles, Russia's boyars, and establish a power structure that will become an absolute monarchy in Russia. And so what Ivan is really doing through his rule, through his government structure, and through his brand of governing, he's setting the standard for future czars as absolute monarchs in Russia. Now, as Ivan gets older, he's becoming increasingly paranoid. He constantly believes that there's traitors all around him. And so, to deal with the traitors that he thinks he sees everywhere, he creates a secret police force called the Oprichniki. And these are not people that you want to mess with. They're very intimidating. They ride black horses, they wear black outfits, and their crest is that image that you see on the top of the screen. It's a broom overlaid with a snarling dog head. The snarling dog head is to symbolize that these guys are the attack dogs of the Tsar, and the broom is to symbolize that they can sweep you under the rug and make you disappear. And Ivan uses this secret police force to terrorize his suspected enemies, to keep a close watch on anyone that he feels is suspicious, and to do his dirty work when need be. Now, as he spirals deeper and deeper into madness, he starts to have many of his closest advisors executed on suspicion of treason. In one particularly nasty event, believing that an entire city was opposed to his rule, he sent the Oprichniki in to sack and burn the city to the ground within his own country and territory. You can kind of see this whole spiraling madness thing. And in another really bad event, he kind of killed his own son and pregnant daughter-in-law in a violent fit of rage. As the story goes, Ivan Jr., who wasn't, a tulip in his own right either, got into an argument with Daddy, Ivan Sr., pertaining to the way that Ivan Jr.'s wife was dressed for a feast, for a dinner engagement, and Ivan Sr. thought she was dressed immodestly, so he struck her and knocked her to the floor, eventually killing her. Ivan Jr. was none too happy with this, and so he and Dad got into an argument which culminated with Ivan Sr. taking that large, heavy iron staff, which you should see at the bottom of the picture there, and clobbering his son over the head with it, cracking his skull, and killing him. He died within a few days there. So, I mean, again, violent sociopathic tendencies. Now, Ivan did express an incredible amount of remorse, and after the death of his son, he sequestered himself in a monastery, and from there he continued to rule Russia with his Oprichniki for the remaining years of his life, which really weren't too many, to be honest with you, because in 1584, Ivan died suddenly when he had a stroke while playing chess with a friend. I guess if you're going to go, why not go playing chess? More dangerous sport than we all realized, I suppose. Following Ivan's death in 1584, Russia drifts into a period of chaos. This is a time that in Russian history they refer to as the time of troubles, because without a solid, strong leader in control, the country is suffering through civil wars, through peasant revolts, through foreign invasions. The great territory that Ivan had built is kind of being whittled down and weakened, and all this chaos continues until 1613, when finally a new Czar is placed on the throne. In 1613, a 17-year-old kid by the name of Michael Romanov becomes the new Czar, bringing stability and control back to the country, and beginning the future long-standing Romanov dynasty. And the Romanov dynasty will continue to rule Russia for the next 300 years, and they'll be the subject of our next screencast on Russia, Part 2. Well, that's where we're going to stop for today, guys. But we got to look at Russia and the fact that it was a very unique and isolated society, very separate and very different from Western Europe. And we saw why Russia was isolated and what made them so unique and so different. And as a result, why they were kind of a backwards Dark Ages society for a long time. That's going to be important for our next session. We met the most important and powerful of Russia's early czars, Tsar Ivan the Terrible, as they like to call him, and how his reign set the standard for absolutist rule in Russia. All future czars after him are going to be absolute rulers. And finally, we finished off very briefly with Russia's time of troubles after Ivan's death, this period of chaos that finally ended when young Michael Romanov became the new czar, thus beginning the Romanov dynasty in Russia. Well, guys, those are the essential questions. Make sure you study them, make sure you know them, be ready to talk about them the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.